All right, so I'll move on to the meat and potatoes of today. So, um, so I don't know how much Deb explained the direction of this unit last week, but essentially, what we're doing is we're moving away from a certain way of developing websites onto a more modern or different way. Okay, so sad to say, in some respects, the way that you've been doing websites and the web units here so far, almost no one makes websites like that anymore. Okay, it's not to say that that stuff that you've learnt is not useful. It is still absolutely very much 100% useful. But in this unit, we add on top of that sort of some new technologies and some new ways of thinking about how we design the way that data and interface is sort of stored and interacts in order to suit the way that the web has been evolving. Okay, so I guess so far, I mean, if you were doing these web units maybe in the late 1990s, early 2000s, up to this point, you would probably have learned pretty much everything there is to know that you needed to know, and you could go and have a career being a web designer or a web developer. Okay, but obviously the web has changed it's changed radically in terms of scale and in terms of use case in the last decade or so, okay, to such a point where it's just infeasible to develop a website of any sort of scale using the static approach that we've done so far. So I'm delivering, I think, this and the next 2 weeks, and they sort of follow on from each other. And so next week I'll talk about what we mean by the dynamic web and why we need it. But I like to preface it first in this week with a little bit of a look at the history of the internet and the World Wide Web. Okay, because I think it's really useful in a couple of ways to understand where things have come from, why they're at where they are now, and possibly maybe a little bit to predict where it might be going in the future. Okay, because this is a field almost like no other, where you constantly have to be learning new things and updating your skills. Okay, so I mean, I think the other reason that looking at I really like looking at the history of things, because I think it takes, if you understand to some degree how things work and why they progressed the way they did, it takes a little bit of that sense of this computer's a magic box that does things out of it. So even if you never get into any field where you have to deal with sort of network technologies or hardware or any sort of stuff like that, some level of understanding about how all this stuff works is really beneficial when it comes to looking at the whole thing from a higher level, which is essentially what we as designers and developers end up doing. Okay, so we'll start at the beginning. I guess basically first we have to define what the internet is. If you ask people what is the internet, it's kind of a hard thing to pin down, because it's sort of a bunch of things separately, but then all of those things together as well. Okay, but so as I say here, the internet as we know it today, it's not really so much a single invention that went, hey, here's the internet. Okay, it's a culmination of a bunch of different technologies and advances that have progressed out of really quite different areas and fields of research. But if we break down some of those components, we might be able to describe some of these as the physical aspect of the internet. Okay, so the wires and the fiber optics that run underground, the satellites that beam electromagnetic waves around, and cell towers. Okay, the actual physical stuff that sends all of that information around the networks. Okay, then we've got the logical sort of layer, which is how information is organized and transported. Okay, so we usually talk about things like network protocols like HTTP and TCP and UDP and all of that stuff. Then we've got the representational, how we represent the data. Okay, and in our case, it's usually visually. Okay, but data can also be used in a completely non-visual way. You can communicate with, especially when you're talking about things with sensors and outputs that are non-visual. You can do complete communication with no visual human interaction at all. And then the interactive, how we actually interact with the data. And in this case, we usually are then talking about interfaces. And this is where we as designers generally sit at that bottom tier, the interactive, how people interact with interfaces and how people interact with other people through those interfaces. So hopefully with this lecture, I'll give you sort of a broad overview of what those other tiers sort of are and where they came from and how it sort of affects everything else. Okay, so where to begin? It's often kind of hard to find a beginning point, but I think as good a place as any to begin with this is 1958. Okay, so in 1958, this was at the beginning of the Cold War. Okay, when basically, you know, the Soviet Union and the United States were basically terrified that they destroy each other in a nuclear war, and they had this big arms race for military and technological superiority. Okay, and this is really what kind of led to the space race. Okay, so you know, for all the noble, you know, we come in peace for all mankind kind of stuff. Okay, the space race was as well kind of a contest to say, you know, our rockets are bigger and better than yours. And really what kind of triggered this off was in 1958, there's the launch of, Russia launched the first sort of satellite. Very crude thing, there's a picture of it. It was essentially just a metal ball which transmitted a ping, okay? But they launched it into space and it orbited the Earth. Okay, and this essentially freaked out the military people in America. They're like, oh, let's put something into space before us. All right, and so when Americans get scared, they tend to chuck a lot of money at something, and in this case, they chucked it into this new agency called DARPA, so the US Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. Okay, and that still exists today. If you've ever seen any of those robotic challenge things that you see videos occasionally, they're usually sponsored by DARPA. Okay, and all of those new military robots that you see going around, they all come out of stuff like that. Now, so as one of the first things that they decided to try and research and build at DARPA was a large-scale computer network with the idea of using that to accelerate knowledge transfer. Okay, so basically they just went, we've got all these scientists and smart people all over the country and our allies in different countries. We want them to be able to collaborate faster and, you know, send information faster than by sending it in the mail. Okay, so that was the sort of the first idea of having some sort of information network. 1962, okay, was something called the Cuban Missile Crisis, and this was pretty much the height of tension of the Cold War. Okay, so the Soviet Union was putting missile bases on Cuba, which basically put them within strike range of a whole lot of major cities in the United States. Okay, and this obviously freaked out America even more. So this time they decided to throw more money at DARPA, and this is where another key aspect of how the Internet as Engineers kind of come apart. So basically what their thinking was, well, okay, we've got this network and it works in a certain way that's all connected. If one of these cities gets attacked, which is a part of the network, then all of a sudden that whole network's going to be taken down and we're in the dark. We can't communicate. Okay, so DARPA was essentially tasked with figuring out how to create a network that would be in some way immune to having one part of it blown up and destroyed, yet still being able to work. So the solution that they came up with was something called a distributed network. So on the left here, I mean, these are two simple diagrams about what the network topology looks like for a centralized network versus a distributed network. Okay, so in a centralized network, you've got sort of the central server location, everything connects to it. Okay, you blow up the server there with one of your missiles, then all of a sudden no one can communicate with each other because they all have to go through this one central place. So the idea was to create a distributed network where there was multiple pathways through different servers, different hosts to be able to get from one endpoint to another. So if one of these connections is severed, okay, then the network doesn't all go down. Yes, that particular place is gone, wiped off the face of the map, but we can still communicate with people in other places that had not yet been destroyed. Okay, and this is one of the really important things that led to the eventual robustness of the internet. Okay, that's why, you know, for the operation of the internet, you never really go on the internet and you go, oh, the internet's not working today, won't use the internet. Okay, if one computer died and took out the entire internet, okay, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work in the way that we need it to work today. So this idea, which was spawned from the fear of having places blown up by nuclear missiles, okay, weirdly, okay, serendipitously ended up in creating an internet that would work in a robust way that we need it for a modern day internet. Okay, and that was 50 years ago. Okay, so around about this time, there were other organizations researching network technology. Okay, and some of the technologies that came out of this are still around today. Among them, one important one to mention is the concept of packet switching networks and also the protocols to standardize transmission of information between different connected networks. Okay, so connected networks, hence the name internet. So this time was around about the first time that people used that term internet. Okay, is when you had a network here, you connect those two together, now the whole thing is an internet. So packet switching, you don't need to worry too much about the technicalities of this, but more what it allows us to do and why it allows the internet to work. So before packet switching, the networks were done with what's called circuit switching. Okay, and you can think of circuit switching like if you've ever sort of seen or read about how the telephone network used to work, pick up the phone, ring an operator, the operator sits in front of this big patch board, and to talk to someone, they actually have to pull a plug and point it into the thing which connects you and creates one connection to the person at the other end. And then you have the conversation, and after that conversation's over, you pull that out and the network's no longer there. Okay, so circuit switching, basically there's only ever that one line of communication between two places. And you can only send data sequentially. So the problem with that from the point of view of a data network is if you were sending a bunch of messages and you had a big long message and a bunch of little small messages, then the small messages couldn't get through until the big one had gotten through. So you had the concept of a queue. All right, so that would be like, let's say, if it worked that way today, you were going on YouTube and looking at a video, and then about a minute into the video, you wanted to do a Google search, but you couldn't do the Google search because you had to wait for the video to download and then go and do the Google search. Okay, so the concept of packet switching gets around this by essentially taking the data and not using one piece of data as the whole thing, but cutting it up into a whole heap of tiny little chunks and then sending them all off. And they can take different paths through the network. They can arrive out of order at different times, but each little packet has sequencing information. So when they do all eventually end up at the endpoint, they can all be put back together into the correct order, and you can get your information. And so if you had a big chunk of information and some little chunks of information, they could all be sent off sort of out of order, and while you were still waiting for the rest of the big chunks, you could view the completed small chunks at the end there. Okay, and as you can see, it also allows us, again, more redundancy in the network by allowing us to take pretty much any path through that network to reach one point to the other. Okay, and you don't need to worry too much about this slide, but basically this slide is really just to demonstrate how physical network topology, okay, like this, then maps to a bunch of different protocols which are used for networking and the internet. Okay, but we don't need to go into that in too much detail. Okay, so by 1969, the networks that DARPA had been working on was sort of released or announced, initiated as they called it, the ARPANET. Okay, so and it was the world's first operational packet switching network and the core network of a set that came to compose the global internet. Okay, so the ARPANET, I guess, is the first internetwork that you can say kind of has the same structure in pretty much every way as the internet that still exists today.
And that was the year we landed on.
Yeah, and that was the same year that we landed on the moon. And it's interesting that, you know, it's interesting that everyone can tell you that we landed on the moon in 1969, but almost no one's probably heard of this. But in terms of how much each one's affected your life, it's kind of interesting. And I guess, yeah, my opinion of that is a rocket landing on the moon just looks much cooler on TV.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next few slides are just a bunch of diagrams of how the network, that ARPANET network, grew over a few years. So as you can see, it really just started off in a handful of different places. So it was, and you can see a lot of these early nodes for the networks were universities, okay? And so they tended to, starting in sort of California, they tended to branch out from there, and they would just add more networks onto it. So that's ARPANET circa 1969. By 1984, okay, they had networks crossing to the east coast of the United States. And even down here, you can see there are some international connections over to Hawaii and Korea, okay, and other countries. That one there says it's going to Frankfurt. Okay, so by 1984, we had a true global, in some sense, a global internet network. And I think it's very interesting to see how much the lead time was. I mean, I think you'd find a lot of people are really surprised. You ask them when did the internet kind of start, they'd say mid-90s, which in a sense is kind of true. That's when it was, you know, kind of starting to become mainstream. But the lead time up to that point was decades, and I think that's quite interesting to just kind of observe that. Just incidentally, in 1972 was the advent of electronic mail, okay, which is probably, again, a lot earlier than people would have expected. So email actually preceded the World Wide Web, so web pages and surfing the internet as we know it today. Email was one of the first communication protocols that kind of existed on the early versions of the internet. Okay, by 1998, okay, more different institutions were getting interested in this internet thing. Okay, and so you had this organization called the US National Science Foundation decided to construct their own internet, which would be essentially a university backbone cables connecting different university networks. Okay, so they sort of branched off from the ones that were sort of part of the originally military network. They branched off and went, okay, we're going to create one that's sort of centered around, you know, academic knowledge sharing and institutions like that. And that ran until 1995, when the infrastructure was then replaced by essentially what they still have today, which is telecommunications companies. Okay, so it's the hardware of the internet sort of passed from military to educational institutions, and now finally to commercial telcos. Okay, and this is a diagram that you'll see these sorts of things. This is a network map of a portion of the internet, and it's color coded to show you the different companies that are responsible for the different bits of the hardware. So it's an interesting when people sort of ask who owns the internet. It's a really quite interesting question, because in one sense it's nobody, but in another very real sense, well, people have had to lay the cables and people have to maintain them, okay? And so generally, ever since about the mid-90s, when it became sort of consumer mainstream, these have all been owned generally by large telcos, okay? And all of the sort of second-tier ISPs below that, they essentially rent time to use the networks from these larger companies. So this is obviously America, and if you know anything about American telco companies, they're all big American telco companies essentially. Okay, in Australia it will essentially be Telstra and Optus. Okay, and then all the other ISPs, they rent the network time off those two. But I suppose another thing to kind of note from that slide is you know, you think about the original intentions for the internet was simply to link military installations, and the fact that it's been able to grow and scale this big is really quite amazing, given that you can be fairly certain that, you know, that was never the original intention. So that's one of the quite marvelous things about that technology. Okay, so now we get to 1989, 1990, around about that era, and this is where we get the World Wide Web. Okay, so, and this is usually the big confusion. What's the World Wide Web and what's the internet, and are they not the same? Are they not the same thing? So the World Wide Web is, if the internet, as we've talked about it so far, okay, is all of that physical infrastructure and the protocols that allow us to send information. Okay, the World Wide Web, which is what we interact with when we open up a web browser, okay? HTML documents, web pages, which hyperlink to other things, okay? That's what the World Wide Web is, and that was developed in sort of 1989, 1990 by this guy, Tim Berners-Lee, while he was working at CERN, which is the Centre for European Nuclear Research. That's the place where they have the LHC. And you might ask why a place that focuses on particle physics was cared about creating internet network protocols and stuff. Well, if you ever look at the amount of data that something like a particle accelerator spits out, it's something on the order of petabytes of data per second. Okay, so there was a heap of information that they're capturing in all these experiments. So actually, this is the perfect thing. What they do with all that information is they capture it and then they farm it out to all these computer farms around the world that do all the processing. Okay, so basically, the idea that Tim Berners-Lee was working on for the World Wide Web was a way of sort of standardizing, a way of sharing that information over this internet network. So what he created was the hypertext transfer protocol, the hypertext markup language, what we know and love as HTML, okay, and he also created the first web browser and the first HTTP web server software. Okay, and any of that stuff, all of that stuff is still in use today, all those same protocols and languages. So by 6th of August 1991, the first website went online, okay, and there's a picture of the computer, which was the first World Wide Web server, okay, which was, interestingly, it was a Next computer. That was the company that Steve Jobs founded after he got booted out of Apple the first time. So pretty much they didn't do anything else for those computers, but it was the first web server. Okay, so the first web page, it actually defined what the World Wide Web is, and so they described it as a wide area hypermedia information retrieval initiative aiming to give universal access to a large universe of documents. Okay, so basically we want to have a bunch of documents, we want to be able to link to them, which was pretty, not super ambitious goals for it. You'll notice that it doesn't make any mention of anything we might talk about interface design at this point. Really, all he cared about was sharing documents of information and being able to hyperlink them together. Okay, and that's actually an archived copy of what the first website looked like. And essentially, it was just explaining what the concept of the World Wide Web was. Now, interestingly, the World Wide Web, which we generally abbreviate to the web now, the web wasn't the only protocol that was developed for sharing information around the internet. Okay, there were other protocols. The reason that this one caught on was essentially because they decided to open source it, make it free to use for anyone for all perpetuity. Okay, so guess which one won out? This one. Okay, so now we're into the era of the web as we kind of know it today. So in the early 90s, okay, it was sort of catching on slowly, mostly still used in educational research institutions. Okay, but this was around about the time when the first web browsers were coming into being. Okay, and this is a screenshot of an early web browser called Mosaic, which was not the first, but the first kind of popular early graphical web browser. Okay, and it did had such awesome features as being able to display inline images in the HTML. And it's interesting to note, I mean, that's still very recognizable as a web browser. The web browsers we have today, they don't look that much different. And so basically anything that's come past from that point kind of refers its heritage back to this browser. Okay, so now we're going to sort of step through a few years at a time, but you'll notice a trend now as more people adopt the web. There's certain things that go in sync with each other. So generally what you have is, and you could say it's kind of a closed circle. One doesn't necessarily precede the other, but you have increases in the capability of the network, so how much bandwidth, how much data can be transferred, and then you have increase in the number of users and also increase in the capabilities of what we can do with the web, which in turn puts more demands on the technology. And you'll see that basically from this point forward and then continuing into the future, that's the cycle that keeps happening. Okay, so in this period, 92 to 95, the bandwidth was really severely limited. Okay, so basically all you were transferring around was text, okay, which doesn't take up much bandwidth. Okay, and the web began to grow from a few hundred web pages, but obviously any sense of web design was severely limited by these constraints. Okay, so there's only so much you can do in terms of design when the only components you have to play with are text, probably no different fonts, and where you place an image, essentially. Okay, but you are starting to get a clear trend towards presenting information in a visual way. Okay, we have graphical web browsers rather than just reading things out on a terminal. This here is a really interesting picture. This is actually how you connected to the internet back then. Okay, so you actually picked up your phone, you dialed into a number, you put it down onto this thing here, which is actually, it's a microphone on one end, so it'll be a microphone on the speaker end and a speaker on the microphone end. Okay, and that's how you actually sent data and read data from the web server that you were communicating with. Okay, so around about this time, the W3C was set up. Okay, so when people using the internet, we should have some sort of overseeing body that kind of recommends where things go and what standards should apply. Okay, and so this is when the W3C was set up, and the World Wide Web Consortium, and they're still around today. And they're responsible for things like, determining what goes into the next version of HTML, the next version of CSS, and all of that sort of stuff. Okay, around this time, so this is sort of the first, this sort of early to mid-90s is the first time where the internet started to be seen as a consumer thing. Okay, and the first internet service providers begin to pop up. Okay, and so this was the era where sort of America Online, and I think there was Australia Online as well, And that era of CD drops in the letterbox, I don't know if anyone remembers that, but essentially they would spam you with CDs in the letterbox and they'd give you 100 hours free or whatever of your internet and then suck you in forevermore. 1995 to 98, this is when commercial interest started to become more prevalent. Okay, and you started to see things like e-commerce popping up. So again, this is all sort of the feedback loop between more people, makes more demands on the network infrastructure. Infrastructure is upgraded, which lets us do more things, which attracts more people. Okay, so, and this was the era where, you know, even though it was still kind of a novelty and quaint with it, it was the possibility of conducting business and selling things online started. Okay, this was also an early era of user-created content. Okay, so there was a site called GeoCities, which allowed you to create your own web page, which were always awesome examples of design.
Steady Dave. That were my days.
And sadly, it's no longer on the internet. It was Yahoo bought it. But they decommissioned it a couple of years ago. But I believe you can actually download a 1 terabyte torrent file of the entire GeoCities, and it should be being archived in the Smithsonian or something, in my opinion. Okay, so 1998. This is the year that Google was founded. Okay, which doesn't seem like that long ago, really. And while it wasn't the first search engine, it was the one which. It was the first one which sort of became ubiquitous, and even now is you know, it has 3/4 or more of the search market. Okay, and Google's become a verb. You don't search something on the internet, you Google it. Okay, so but it's interesting why at this point this became a thing. Okay, it's because as more data goes on the internet, okay, then all of a sudden, when there's only a few hundred web pages, you could probably have an index of web pages and what they are. You type them in, okay? When there's a few million or a few billion, okay, then suddenly discovery of that kind of stuff is not as easy, okay? So the concept of a search engine becomes really useful, something which allows you to find information even when you don't know where it is. So Google's founded with a mission statement to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Okay, 1995 to 98, this is when you hear people talk about the browser wars, which essentially means Netscape versus Internet Explorer. So Netscape and Internet Explorer were the first two sort of behemoths of the web companies. And essentially what they did was they had a feature arms race, okay, to try and attract more people. They put more they put more features in their browser, okay. So our one can do blinking text and marching ants and all of this sort of stuff, and animated GIFs and JavaScript button rollovers. Okay, and in one sense this was great, it pushed the technology forward, but in another sense it led to a very frustrating situation for designers, whereas it started to deviate where there wasn't this standardized compatibility between what websites would work on what browsers. Okay, and ultimately Netscape kind of got pushed out, not so much because it wasn't as good, but Microsoft did a very clever thing where they basically bundled Internet Explorer for free with every version of Microsoft Windows, which was on about 99% of the world's PCs, and so most people aren't going to go and bother and download another browser. It just became the de facto standard. Okay, and then eventually Netscape morphed into Firefox, which is what we know Firefox today. Okay, now just to switch over a little moment and talk about design. Okay, this is where sort of some sense of design starts to be the technology of the browsers is enough that there is actually scope for having some design thought about what a web page looks like. Okay, but around this time there wasn't, it was this sort of time where everyone's like, yeah, the web's really hip to be on the internet. We need a web presence, but I don't know what we're going to put on there. Just put something there. Okay, so the general the general sort of trend was to have, advertising a web presence rather than any useful content or services. Essentially having an internet billboard that said, yeah, we're a company that's on the internet. Okay, so generally this led to websites which just screamed, hey, look at me, and had a whole lot of interesting things on it. And I've got a couple of links there to a couple of sites that have a nostalgic look back at 90s web design, which are a nice trip down memory lane. But you had things that look like this. Okay, so dancing baby gif, under construction signs everywhere. Okay, so this is sort of what a 90s era website kind of looked like, and you can see that the amount of useful content that is kind of there is almost non-existent. Okay, but basically it just says, it screams, hey, look at me, look what I can do with this technology. And every year I do this, I look at this with a little less horror and a little more nostalgia, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so
the dancing baby was the lolcat.
Does that website actually would have been made 5% linked to YouTube?
This website here is actually, I've changed it a bit from time to time. This is not actually a website from that era, but this is a website that's created recently, which allows you to put in any website and turn it into a website that looks like a 90s website.
Yeah,
right. So we can take let's take the QUT website.
Because it's almost been enough time for us to have nostalgia for 90s web. There's enough of a gap now that some people are actually mimicking it again.
Yeah, it's starting to become trendy. There we go. Oh, look at that.
Oh, yeah. That's pretty much what it looks like.
Oh.
In part, there's probably some improvement.
Man, he's had a turnaround in image, hasn't he?
Wow. Did they just slip that in there?
Yeah, they just inject a whole bunch of crap into it. Yeah, so, yep, that's the GeoCitiesizer website. Okay. Oh.
And there is a place where you can see former versions of websites.
Yeah, there's a couple of links on this previous slide.
It's actually quite interesting to look at the design change over the years, because it tells you something about where we're going as well. Or it's good to take nostalgic elements from the past just to show how clever you are in terms of website design. So sometimes I go and revisit old websites.
I mean, everything comes back around eventually, right? One of my favourite ones is so yeah, I've got a couple of articles here that actually they have some old ones. One of my favourite ones is, if it's still there. I hope they haven't updated it because they're making a remake, but the original Space Jam website was up there for years.
I think it is.
There it is.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
Still the original Space Jam website from 1996.
Backgrounds, heavily tiled backgrounds.
Yeah, tiled backgrounds.
Yeah.
Which I mean, like, you know, it's the same thing. It's what the technology can support. Where you couldn't. It would have been insanity to have a full resolution background image back then, because it would have taken 20 minutes to download. But having a tiny little tiled image like this was kind of as far as you could push the technology.
I mean, I remember when table
Yes.
came out. That changed everything. You know, like, I wrote websites before we had table tags. So, like, every time something, and now it's exhausting to keep up.
But also look at the density of information, right? So if this was Wikipedia, you'd say I can't read this. The contrast is horrible. But I suppose when it's only 2 lines of text, it's not that bad.
Don't encourage it, eh?
It's not as heinous as it might be if it was Wikipedia. Okay, right? So this is you've always got to ask yourself. You've always got to think about context. Okay, and really the information density is. You see this push today towards minimalism, and really that's, you know, in some way you could say that's just come out of sort of an aesthetic approach, but at the same way it's almost become a necessity because the information density has increased so much. There's not room for all this flowery interface additions. there was back then because you needed it to fill up space. Otherwise, you just had a couple lines of text in the middle of a blank screen. Okay, so it's always interesting to think, you know, why did someone design this in the way that they did? And it's tempting to just think because they were insane or colorblind, okay, but usually it's more complex than that. Just remember that people are going to laugh at you in 20 years as well. Okay, late 2000s, traditional interface design principles start to become more seriously applied to website designs. This was an era where sort of web designers were being pulled over from print design. So the tools that they used to design websites needed to be kind of what they were used to in terms of graphical direct manipulation tools. So you had these things like Dreamweaver, okay, which is lambasted today because it can output, you know, non-ideal code, but back then it was a good way for someone with no knowledge of the underpinnings of how it worked to be able to actually create an interface. Okay, so content is becoming more important and web design begins to focus on servicing that content. Okay, but the presentation and content is still combined, specified within the HTML markup, and it's not possible to make one independent of the other. Okay, so CSS at this point still doesn't exist. Website layouts at this period tend to look square because their layouts are based mostly on tables. Okay, and that's something which is the first thing that people tell you not to do today. Don't do your layout based on tables. But back then, that's the only way you could do it. There was no other way of arranging elements in a grid unless you used HTML tables. Okay, this is a screenshot of a website, A List Apart, which is still around today. It's a website which does lots of good articles on, you know, the design area. Okay, and you can see generally looked like things were in quite a distinct blocky grid. Okay, and that's generally what happens when you design things with tables. Okay, end of the century. This is when we had the dot-com boom and bust. Okay, so there's this, you know, everyone finally realizes the internet is a buzzword, is going to be a huge thing. So everyone jumped on it, and lots of money was thrown into web businesses. Okay, and so these businesses became massively inflated. They're like, we don't know how we're going to make money, but, you know, this internet thing's big. So, and then there was a massive tech bubble and then a tech bust, okay, and heaps of money was wiped off the stock market. There was things like people buying domain names and selling them for $1 million. The one I keep remembering is Sausage Software, sold for $1 million and never got used for anything, right? Okay, so basically this was people had been ignoring the internet for a while, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, hang on, it's going to be this thing, and then they get overexcited and they invest heaps in it, but they don't really know what they're going to do, okay, and then all of a sudden people realize, oh, we don't actually have any plan to make money, okay, and then big bust. Okay, and then, so it went back down, you know, the hype got taken out of the internet, and then since then it's basically been building up again, and on a higher and higher trajectory. Okay, but around early 2000s, this is when the shift over from sort of dial-up being common to broadband being common was happening. So high-speed internet connectivity became more affordable. And this also meant that people started for the first time to be the potential to be constantly connected to the internet. For this, you dial up, you log on to the internet, you check your email, and then someone tries to ring the phone, you get disconnected. Okay, in this way now we've got dedicated access to the internet. There's also a push towards standardizing the web to try and solve the nightmare of developing for different browsers that you know you wanted to be able to develop once and have it look the same in all the web browsers. There's a continuing trend of more content more often. The idea of separating presentation and content, allowing each to be updated independently, started to become a thing. So this is when CSS, cascading style sheets for presentation, was released. Okay, and very importantly, this is when we start to see a move away from static web pages like the ones that we've been doing so far towards dynamic websites, okay? But I'll talk much more specifically to that next week. This is just a screenshot of CSS Zen which is generally used as the demonstration of, how you can have the same content and different CSS and change the layout completely. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that website. 2004 to roughly 2007 is what you might call the Web 2.0 era. Okay, so this is when this is a very interesting transition period. It's when we kind of finally realized that original plan for the web of just sharing documents wasn't really going to cut it anymore, and there was now a push towards, rather than just having links to documents that you would load up, we really wanted something that was more like web applications. Okay, so data that we could interact with and rich interfaces that we could interact with, ideally in the same level that we would interact with native applications. Okay, but that they were the information, with all the benefit of the information and the connectivity of the internet. Okay, so some aspects of these web applications was that they started to be highly dynamic, community-oriented. This is where we start to see lots of user-contributed content, okay? Things like Facebook and YouTube and Wikipedia, okay? Where pretty much all of the content is not created by the people who administer the website, it's created by the users of it, okay? And that's really gone to being pretty much the norm now for a lot of websites. Social networking starts to take off, and purchasing goods and services online via sites like eBay and Amazon becomes mainstream to the point where it threatens traditional retailers. So it's really interesting if you go through and look at the news surrounding e-commerce, over the years, it goes from being this quaint thing that will never work to, oh yeah, a few people are doing it, but it's not that great, to yeah, I do most of my shopping online. And now, just as of last week, Amazon has actually overtaken Walmart as the largest retailer in the world. Okay, so here's some more screenshots of websites from around this era. We've got Flickr, which was one of the first big social photo sharing sites. It still exists today, but has sort of been cannibalized a lot by things like Facebook. Wikipedia, which actually started in 2001. Wikipedia is a really good example of one of the earliest and most obvious uses for a dynamic website. And I'll talk more to that next week again. Then we've got YouTube and Facebook. Okay, so these are all highly dynamic websites. They're all websites that would be completely infeasible to do as static websites. If you just do a thought experiment, imagine trying to maintain those websites, taking content from users, publishing it, and your only ability is to edit individual HTML files, okay, it's just not going to work. 2008 onwards, okay, we get a trend towards real-time or almost real-time updates. So again, this is a trend. We go from, logging onto the internet maybe once a day to check your email and whatever, okay, to being connected all the time. You can barely, do an experiment, time yourself how long you can go before checking your phone, okay? You're constantly on, constantly connected, constant information. And this trend just continues. There's also a trend for content to find users rather than for users to go searching for it. Okay, so things like RSS feed subscriptions, Twitter updates, sites like Reddit and stuff where they're sort of crowdsourced, voted content. Storing personal data in the cloud becomes a thing. Content mashups, so combining data from different sites or different sources and mashing them up in a new interface. Embedded widget feed services using external APIs. So again, that's having services which offer data, they don't necessarily provide the interface themselves, but they offer data for other people to develop services and interfaces around. And designing for multiple devices, okay, especially mobile. So 2000, early 2000s was kind of the first internet on phone era, okay, but anyone who used it then will tell you without a doubt it was utterly crap. Okay, until basically 2007, it was when the iPhone was released, okay, which basically has been the template for phones to this day, to the point now where mobile web consumption is, in a lot of instances, the primary mode of interacting with the internet. Okay, so just in the last few years, we've gone from a web designer's job being designed for a screen like this to now, definitely smartphones, but then expanding all the time. Okay, I've got watches now, virtual reality things, Google Glass, all this stuff, and who knows which of those things are going to catch on and which aren't. Large displays, touchscreen inputs, all this different stuff. Okay, but it's definitely branching out. The one thing you can say, it's going to branch out more. It's not going to get narrower. Just some more screenshots representing these type of things. Twitter, there's the Facebook mobile app, an earlier version, and Google Maps, which to this day I think is still the most impressive data mashup, high information density interface that I've ever seen. Now, just a word on cloud computing. So cloud computing is kind of this buzzword that's been thrown around. In some senses, you can just use cloud as a synonym for the internet. Okay, data just lives in the cloud. It's a way of abstracting. I don't want to know what goes on behind the scenes. I just know my data's there somewhere. Okay, but there has been this interesting trend with cloud computing, which has in some sense reversed an old trend. So if we go way back again for a moment, back when computers were the size of a house and expensive and slow, okay, what you would generally have is something called a mainframe computer, which was this big room-sized thing, and then it was the only thing that was big enough and powerful enough to do any of the processing. So if you wanted to use that, you had what were called dumb terminals connected to that, which was essentially just a screen and a keyboard for input. Okay, and you did your input there, but the information got sent to the mainframe, computed, and delivered back. Okay, and then as the engineering got better, the computing became smaller and more powerful. Okay, now we don't need that big expensive mainframe. We can do all the computing on our own devices, on our computer, on our phone, all that stuff. Okay, so there was that trend of decentralizing computing, but now what's very interesting is we've got a trend of now re-centralizing our data, okay? Not the computing, but the data. So whereas for the for the sort of 90s, 2000s, you would have all your data on your computer, you'd have data on your phone. Okay, now the idea is that the data will be decentralized. So we don't necessarily store a whole heap of data on our devices. We have it all in the cloud so that we can access it from any of our devices anywhere we want. Okay, and that's how you have things like Spotify for streaming music. You've got your Google Drive for storing your documents. You've got your Gmail for your email, all that sort of stuff. Okay, so this is another sort of, I suppose you could say, trend that will most likely continue is more of our data gets moved off our devices into a centralized place. Okay, and then you have lots of discussions about all of the issues around that in terms of security and all of that stuff. Okay, as I'm sure you know, all of the iCloud hacking stuff that happened last year. All right, but that's, I don't know, topic for another day. Okay, so if we look at the trends going through there, we can identify some pretty clear trends. Okay, there's more content, which is more frequently up to date and on demand from more sources and on more devices. And in order to accommodate this, moving away from a static web to a dynamic web, okay, which is what I will be talking about next week. In terms of more contributors, this really does affect you and in the way that you work as part of a unit or a team, or even if you're an individual creating a website, okay? So whereas back in the day, it would be very common to have one person responsible for the creation, maintenance, and administration of an entire website. Now, for a website of any scale, it's just not possible. Okay, so you're going to be working with a lot more people. If it's a large if it's a large-scale website in terms of development, then you'll probably be doing smaller bits of each different thing and having to interact more with people, okay? And this is why communication and things like documentation and planning and all of this stuff becomes really important in terms of working in a team. But then more broadly beyond that, you also have to consider that all of the content that is in this day and age now provided by our users. Okay, even if that's something as simple as on your website, you have comments on your blog, that then brings in the whole idea of, you know, do you have to moderate comments and all that sort of thing. Okay, and this will also just continue to expand. This is a little bit of an aside, but this is just a nice interactive that I found, which is sort of visualize the evolution of web technologies. It's mainly focused on browsers, but I think it's interesting nonetheless, and it's done completely in HTML, and I think it's quite a nice interface. It's exactly what you said last year.
Have I seen it before?
Yes. I rewatched the screen. I rewatched the screencast. That's exactly what he said. So you can pick out any technology you like. Let's say HTML canvas, and we can track it through here from what year it started and when it was supported in all these browsers. And yeah, I just think this is a really nice interface, but it's also a good way of demonstrating the capabilities of modern web design. It has two sections, browser technologies and the growth of the internet. So this is also a very interesting one. So we've got two lines of data here. The top one is global internet users and the bottom one is global internet traffic in petabytes per month. Okay, and so, I mean, that's probably a fairly obvious trend. So what do we have here? 2.27 billion users. Okay, and if we go back to 1996 even, 100 million, okay, and before that, let's see, 1993, not many at all. Okay, let's check the time. All right, we're nearly finished. So what about the future of the internet? Now, predicting the future is something that's, anyone who predicts the future is bound to look stupid at some point. Okay, but it's worthwhile thinking about at least where we're at and possibly which are the things that are just sort of not mainstream yet that may become more mainstream. Okay, and the thing that's sort of generally talked about now is the Internet of Things. I've got a video here, but I won't play it. You can look at it later, which talks about that, and I think
we have a lecture on the
there'll be a lecture of that later. Okay, but generally, as of now, what we're tending to look at is sort of an explosion of more devices and different ways of interacting with our devices. Okay, so things like smartwatches, Google Glass, health kit apps, stuff like that. Okay, one that I've found has just started to creep into the mainstream just in the last year or so is the idea of smart lighting. Has anyone played with Philips Hue or anything like that? So a bulb that you can screw in that has Wi-Fi and you can adjust the color and all this stuff with your app remotely. You can turn the lights on and off from out of your home, and I know a few people have started to install those in their houses recently. And I mean, the smart home thing has been talked about since at least the 1980s, okay? So it's interesting to see, you know, when stuff starts to be talked about, when it becomes a technical reality, and then when it's going to become mainstream. So that's quite interesting to just think about those things. And I really do think looking at the past gives us a better way of predicting what might happen in the future. Okay, and just finally, I've got 3 videos here which look at different, which are snapshots of sort of different eras of the web. I'll play maybe 1 or 2 of them if we've got time. Yeah. The first one I won't play. It's a bit longer and I can't watch it.
Actually, probably a bit.
I'll just play one then.
Okay,
the first one I can't watch it because it's just too cringy, but it's 2014's reacting to a 90s internet video. And then we've got a 1981 news report about the internet, which actually shows you the use of the phone doing the modem thing. But I'll just play this one, which is a compilation of mid-90s news reports about the internet. Just remember that it is mid-90s, 1905, this is 20 years ago, okay? And to look how ridiculous these people seem talking about it now, and just think about what that might be like in another 20 years. So I'll just play this one.